Well, hello there. So excited to be back this week. We have such a great episode for you. It's so interesting. I was thinking about all the things that I wanted to share with you. I've recently been traveling quite a bit, in fact. So over the past month, I've been in Dallas. I was at the PIMDCon conference, which was amazing. I got to talk there on optimal help for physicians. And then I was in Arizona speaking at the Brave Enough conference, and I talked all about stress and how stress impacts your health. And what I found is that really spending some time diving in to stress, understanding how it impacts your health, understanding how some amount of stress is actually good. Okay, we're going to talk about that. And then really, how do we get ourselves to kind of a thrive zone as it relates to our stress? And so the next 3 episodes are really going to dive into all of this. So the purpose of episode 1, which is today, we're going to talk all about stress and your body. So the typical stress response, what that entails, and really what we can expect from that response. Okay, in episode 2, we're really going to dive into your stress scale. I talk about the stress scale in my programs all the time, and I think that this would be a really nice opportunity to reference and talk about the stress scale. You can actually start implementing it right away just by listening to this podcast. And then finally, we're going to talk about your thrive zone and your productivity zone as it relates to your stress. Now, the reality is that we are not going to be super productive if we're completely stress-free. And many of us really do want to be productive. I want to set the stage for really starting to embrace stress, but really trying to then also keep it in a zone that is going to be productive versus detrimental. Okay, so I'm really excited about this. And I have to tell you a funny story because my younger daughter is quite empathetic, okay? And she's very smart. And so she picks up on my stress, which, for better or worse, it is what it is. We're very kind of connected in that way. And so one of the funny things that now I know, if she's sensing that I'm overly stressed, she makes the comment, "You good?" Question mark, kind of like, "You good? You good?" Okay, and that's my little signal that, okay, I must be letting off some energy that is probably on the higher end. And so it's just created a really nice awareness for me as well. And that's the one thing I want to tell you. When we start talking about stress, our stress can impact those that we are close with. As much as we want to say that this is my stress and I'm owning my stress, a lot of times, let's just say my actions that are a result of my stress, they do impact other people, okay? And so it's just really important to be aware. After all, we are human, so we can't eliminate the idea and the fact that we are going to impact other people, but we do have a say in how we want to show up. And we do get to show up in that way however often we want to, okay? It's really a choice. And I think that when we start living our lives realizing that we do have a choice in all of this, it really starts to give us ownership of how we show up, okay? All right, so let's dive in. Okay, so when we think about stress response, let's just get a little sciencey here. So what happens is the hypothalamus is going to release CRH, which is corticotropin release hormone. Okay, so when this happens, it's going to scoot on down to the pituitary, which is going to release ACTH, okay, which is going to then scoot on down to the adrenal glands. And this is where we're going to release adrenaline, of course, but cortisol. And so typically we hear a lot about cortisol when we're talking about stress. So I do want to definitely dive into cortisol a bit because it has huge impact on our health. Okay. But let's go one step further here. When we talk about the CRH, corticotropin release hormone, about 30% of the population actually has a variant in that gene, meaning that we are hyper responsive to stress. So let's just say that there's a stressor. It can be a person, it can be a place, it can be a thing. And we feel stress over it. We might actually release more cortisol. Okay, and that is a real thing. And so one of the things that I've noticed a lot in my individual clients who are hyper responders to cortisol, what I usually find is that when their bodies are under stress, and let's just say they are trying to lose weight, they have a very difficult time. And so what I find for my high stress responders is that if we actually focus on stress management versus macros, they wind up doing much better, and they actually wind up seeing results more significantly than if we added more stress to them and told them, hey, listen, we really have to dial in your macros right now, okay? That's typically not going to work. And so there's just such a big component of stress as it relates in particular to weight loss, also muscle gain. And I'm going to talk about that when I talk about cortisol a little bit further. But just so you know, physiologically speaking, cortisol stress does have impact. Now, as I mentioned, some amount of stress is good. It's okay. It makes us productive. So we are by default going to release some cortisol. Cortisol is actually necessary. The idea is that we don't want the extremes of things. Okay. One of the ideas is that as humans, we like the extremes because they're more certain, right? So if we are, a 10 out of 10, we know what a 10 out of 10 is. And if we're a 1 out of 10, we know what a 1 out of 10 is. But trying to fill in the blanks of, okay, so what's my stress like at a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, a 8, a 9? Those are harder to fill in. We typically are more aware of max stress and least amount of stress. Everything in between gets a little bit fuzzy. So you're probably asking yourself, what would be a stress level that would be really healthy for me? You might already start having, those questions. And so we're going to try to answer them. Okay, let's go into cortisol a little bit. So I mentioned ultimately cortisol is going to be released. And what I described to you with CRH, ACTH, adrenaline, cortisol, that's your fight or flight response. Okay. Now, the idea is that in that very initial phase of fight or flight, you're going to have that response and it's going to be a little bit exaggerated. Let's say that you were to stay under that same amount of stress. Over time, your body kind of acknowledges that stress as normal and starts to kind of calibrate all of its hormones to meet that stress level all of the time, which then develops into more of a chronic pattern of stress. And this is where we start to see burnout and we start to see all the things that we actually really do not want to see. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, with cortisol. So cortisol does some interesting things with blood sugar. Okay, so cortisol actually increases blood glucose. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because when we're in fight or flight, or when cortisol gets released, what do we want to have happen? We want our brain to have more glucose utilization. We want our brain to have more available to it. And that's because we have to think quick. We have to think quick to survive. Okay, so we have something called gluconeogenesis, which is where our liver gives up some blood, or gives us some glucose or glycogen, and our blood sugars can increase. Okay, so then the idea is that if we have increased blood sugars, what's going to happen? Well, typically we would release insulin to try to bring those levels down. But cortisol also impacts insulin, okay, in the way that it brings blood sugar levels down. It actually can inhibit the release of insulin. And the other thing that it does, because insulin actually helps substrate go intracellular. So for example, let's say that you had a starving muscle cell and insulin was available along with glucose, that insulin's going to drive glucose into that muscle cell intracellularly. Okay, so the idea is that if insulin is working properly, that's going to happen. But see, cortisol impairs the way that insulin works. So insulin's not as good as kind of pumping, let's just say, muscle cells, brain cells, all those things with that glycogen, okay? Because the insulin just is not working up to par. Okay, so you would think like, oh wow, cortisol is causing more, glycogen to be available. So that would make sense that we would potentially have a benefit, but actually it's quite opposite, because the hormone insulin that we need to actually make the glycogen be available and usable is just not working as well. Okay, now imagine that happening chronically over time. So we know that with a lot of stress and having this increased cortisol, it can lead to insulin resistance because we're going to have elevated blood sugars over a long period of time. And so again, over time, stress really can impact that. Just like sleep. So sleep actually has huge detriment to how we actually utilize glucose. And so if somebody is chronically sleep deprived, they actually develop a pre-diabetic state. And that has been shown even in really young, healthy men. So there was one study that essentially took young men and gave them 6 hours of sleep per night. The initial labs before the study showed completely normal hemoglobin A1C, completely normal blood sugar levels. But after the sleep deprivation for an entire week, everything started shifting and started seeing blood glucose levels kind of more in the pre-diabetic range. Okay, and so when that happens, right, that is going to be more stressful. And also remember, stress also impacts our sleep. Okay, so think about when you're really stressed. And it's one of the things we're going to get into when we talk about the stress scale. If you're at a level 9 stress, that's a really high level, by the way, you're not going to want to just go take a nap. That's not going to happen. You actually have to work yourself down the stress scale in order to be willing to take a nap. Okay. One of the things, even as a young kid for me, I never wanted to take a nap. So I would fight it. I didn't want to do it. I was worried I'd be missing something. And when I think back, I would definitely identify myself as someone who is a higher stressed person. And that is actually something else we should discuss. So there are low stress responders, moderate stress responders, and high stress responders. Now, there's not clear definitions on how you would define each, person, but what I can tell you is this. A low stress response person, it's, they're not super impacted by the different triggers that are out there in the world. Either they've done a lot of work on it, and that's the reality. So most people that are low stress responders, it's learned. They actually have really good tools. Okay, they're utilizing tools to keep their stress response on the lower end. Individuals who are moderate stress responders, again, they might have some tools, but they're not being consistently used. And again, the other component of this is genetic. Okay, so the way that we manage stress, and I mentioned even with the cortico release hormone, that's genetic. Right? So there are genetics involved with how we are as a stress responder. But typically, if you're going to be a moderate stress responder, you also can feel a physiological response with your stress. Okay? So in other words, a moderate responder, you're going to have sensations or symptoms. So for example, butterflies in the stomach, heart rate is going to go up. I get tingling in my fingers actually when I'm under a lot of stress. Muscle contractions. So you're going to start to see that you hold your muscles a little bit more contracted. So I would say you start actually seeing, signs that you're holding the stress in your body. And then a high stress responder, typically reactive. Okay, this is if they do have tools, they're not aware of the tools, or they're just so stressed that they're not able to access their tools. Okay, the reason why this matters is because the way that we all handle stress is going to be different. Therefore, the way that we want to implement kind of stress reduction techniques is also going to be very different. For example, if you have somebody that's a moderate stress responder, just by them having more awareness of their early symptoms of stress can be key. Whereas somebody who has high stress response, they're going to go from 0 to 90 pretty quickly. So those early signals of stress, they might not be that obvious, okay, because it's just such a quick pattern from 0 to 90, okay? So really important to kind of think about when you define yourself as a stress responder. And the other thing too I want to tell you as it relates to genetics, there's other types of genes that do control like startle reflex, for example. So there's a calcium channel gene that if there's a variant in that gene, you will be startled, more likely to be startled. Okay. And again, that really does feed into more of that fight or flight response. Okay. Again, a bunch of genetics, right? So nature, nurture, all the things, just having somebody who modeled how to handle stressful times, that's really important. And so one of the things that I'll tell you is that while I probably define myself as a moderate stress responder, but a high moderate, my dad is a physician and his office was in our house. So I many times witnessed him in kind of pretty critical situations because there'd be a car accident on a country road and it would come right to our house. And I was able to watch him handle stressful situations. And so that was really helpful for me to see that modeling. And so while I might be a moderate to high stress responder naturally, knowing and just having confidence that there are tools available definitely helped with that. And so I might feel that initial fight or flight, but then by me not allowing that to escalate and instead, again, utilizing tools, it really helps to kind of keep that stress more in a productive range rather than in a detrimental range. Okay, so you can kind of see where I'm going with this. It's this idea that we live in a world where stress is going to happen. As humans, you are going to feel stress. Okay, now fight or flight is going to determine how the stress pathway gets triggered. Okay, but there's a lot of different hacking we can do along the way because the goal is to manage our stress. We can't avoid stress, but we can manage our stress. Okay, so here's what you have to know. When we start to talk about this, we probably want to get down to why is this so important? Okay, at the end of the day, everything comes down to our thoughts, right? Like, how are we thinking about something? Well, when we talk about our thoughts, in the different sciences, so cognitive behavioral therapy deals with thought patterns, right? Thoughts create feelings, create behaviors. So dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, it is actually CBT, but it focuses more on emotions. So it talks a lot about distress tolerance, okay? Emotional regulation, interpersonal communication, and mindfulness. So if you notice what I said, okay, I'll say it again. So distress tolerance, okay? So stress tolerance, all right? Distress tolerance, stress tolerance, right? Emotional regulation, okay? So when we're stressed, we're having big emotions, being able to regulate them, okay? See where I'm getting at here? And then we move into mindfulness. Well, how do we become aware of our stress? How do we target what we need in that moment to alleviate that stress or at least manage that stress? Mindfulness. Okay, and then what about interpersonal communication? Okay, we're not on this world alone. We're not living solo. So the idea that we have to communicate, that is actually going to be a huge component of how we do manage stress. A lot of times we want to hide our stress because we don't want to negatively impact anybody else. The reality is that all humans will experience stress. And the way that we can help navigate it together, because we do influence one another, it's really going to be helpful in how we can show up. And that's the first thing I said. I said, at the end of the day, we are in control of how we show up. Okay, so in recap, right? Stress has a physiological response on our body. We know that. We can't control the idea that we are going to be under some amount of stress. We can control how we manage it. Okay, so episode 1, which is this episode, is all about just that awareness of how stress is in your life and how it is showing up and how you are managing it. When we move into episode 2, which is coming up next week, I'm going to describe to you the stress scale. Now, the stress scale is super useful as it relates to 2 of the main principles of DBT. It talks about distress tolerance, and it also talks about emotional regulation, okay? So as we work through this series in the next 2 episodes, we're going to be talking all about your stress scale, how to create it so you actually can set yourself up to then manage your stress. And then finally, in the last episode, we're going to talk all about that idea of really finding your productivity zone with your stress, and particularly finding your thrive zone as it relates to your stress. All right, my friends, we have such amazing things coming up. You're definitely going to want to check out all the programs we have available to you. We have 3 do-it-yourself programs. We have Beginner Strength. This is a year-long program where you have 3 new workouts every single week, all 10 minutes, taught at 3 different levels. We have our advanced strength training. That's our 20 and 30-minute workouts. And then we have our total fitness program. This is our core and floor. This is our advanced strength, our beginner strength, our yoga routines, our meditation program. It's all available to you in a do-it-yourself in our app for an entire year. So you're going to want to check out those programs. And then the programs that are coach-led, we have 3 awesome programs. So we have a nutrition training program, which will be going to a do-it-yourself model soon. It's an amazing program, 48 CME credits. We have our Transform program, which we are taking deposits for. So this is our 72 CME credit program. also a year long. This is where you work with me directly. And then the final program is called Optimal GLP-1 Weight Loss. This is if you are on a GLP-1 agonist, you come into our community and you work with our 5 obesity medicine physicians, and we manage exercise, nutrition, behavioral change, mindset work, and also community. All right, my friends, as always, it's great being here. And until next time, we'll talk soon.